Ja, herzlich willkommen, einen schönen guten Abend. A warm welcome to everybody. We are very happy to have quite a full audience here. And of course, very happy to have Sam Jacob with us, who will present his work. And first of all, I would like to officially thank, in the name of the Zentralvereinigung, all our partners who are making this possible. First of all, of course, our generous host, Bene, Markus Eibelmeier and Tabea Rauscher, who are here and helping us to get everything organized. And then the Wiener Städtische, Aldo König Stahl, and the Ministry of Culture were also supporting these events. So, and then to you, Sam. I've been reading up today in preparation for this, and it's been very interesting, involving a lot of flashbacks, in a way. So, you studied in Glasgow, and you were not quite sure that architecture was the right fit, but you found a lot of other things to do around studying architecture, and then you founded in '95 FET, which when I started studying, which was in '95, quite famous, quite soon. And FET is known for fashion, architecture, and taste, and I think the taste is quite an interesting thing because it's not necessarily about the good taste as we understand it as architects, and I think this is something that's probably still a huge topic for you in some ways or not, so it would be interesting. And of course, you don't want to talk about the past too much today, but there's also a Viennese past that you had in 2002, a very interesting exhibition where a lot of very influential young architects were working Trespassing, which was organized by Angelika Fitz, who today is leading the Architekturzentrum, and you are teaching at the Angewandte, so I think things are coming back in a very nice and round way. So you will present the work of Sam Jacob Studio, which you founded in 2014, and I think the best thing is to just let you talk about your work, which we like a lot and which has been very impressive in very particular moments, I think, very to the point of what one can do with architecture. So thank you very much for being here, and please come to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for your introduction, Nina, and thanks for the invitation to speak. Yeah, I'm going to speak a little bit about the more recent work. So there's a history of FAT projects, which I won't go into, but they often were interested in being a kind of disgusting, in a sense, to use taste as a way of, let's say, trying to think about and to argue for the relationship between taste, value, and class, which in short is a kind of the politics of architecture. And at that point, we thought, well, perhaps the politics of architecture resides very much on the surface rather than in space or the kinds of things which we were seeing maybe a generation older than us being interested in. However, that was one project, and FAT ended at a certain point. We decided to end the project of FAT. And so since then, there's been many other things happening. What I wanted to talk today about, I think, this is a kind of general theme, something that I'm very interested in and kind of runs as a thread through a lot of different kinds of projects that I work on, which is to think of architecture as a form of representation. So that's not just the representation of architecture, but it's thinking of architecture itself as a representational medium. And that medium works in a number of different ways. And one way of slicing it up is to say that these could be ways of thinking about the role of architecture in wider society. So first of all, how it represents. So that could be, let's say, how we make drawings, how we make representations of architecture. It could be about who it represents, which you could say is the kind of political dimension of architecture. How does it engage with the communities and users, etc., that it's always entangled with? And maybe what it represents. That could be discipline, you could say, which is sort of how it engages with, let's say, issues of canon, references, history. And so I think these ways of thinking, which are not only limited to thinking about drawing, politics and discipline, they could be also thought of in lots of different ways. I think are useful ways to sometimes step back from the production of architecture to think about what is it doing, what's its role in the world. I'm going to start, though. I thought some of you might be curious. I can see one of my students in the back of the room here. The rest of them are still on a field trip in Paris, which we've just finished, which was a marvelous trip. The weather was fantastic. Paris looked glorious. I thought I'd show some of the student work which has been going on in the studio at the Angewandte, which has been, I think, 1.5 years now. And after that, I'll show some of my own studio's work. I wanted to start with this, the typeface. This was the first thing that we did, first 2-week workshop. We thought, okay, we need an identity. We need to really say something's changed here. And the typeface was developed as a kind of project which was about the relationship of some things which can be very small and some things which are very big. Letters and the city. And it was formed by students taking walks and making journeys through Vienna and then finding letter forms. And they might be as part of a shop sign, they might be on a newspaper, they might be, anywhere that you find type in the city. And from that, we made a kind of selections and redrew them and turned them into a typeface which we can put on the computer and type things. And so this is it. This is lowercase, this is uppercase. Sometimes they're the same because we didn't have 2 H's, for example. Numbers, some punctuation, not all punctuation. But it was a project, I think, a little bit about, I guess, the ways in which, let's say, multiple voices could be brought together to create a singular thing. So in this case, it's the multiple voices or the multiple experiences of the students. It's the multiple sites within the city and how that can all be brought together to become one whole. So I guess in some sense it's about a kind of diversity, but also it's about what do you do with diversity? What do you do with multiplicity? Which maybe is a question which I think is quite an important one in our current climate. Other projects, this is another kind of small workshop, which was the introduction to a larger kind of architectural brief, which was really about relationships between furniture of different kinds of status. Furniture which comes from, let's say, a kind of high culture position, and furniture which comes from a low culture position. So things which have codes, essentially, to begin to help us understand that design is also a language, and that one we actually are very familiar with, but we perhaps don't always recognize that it's speaking to us in particular ways. So from tours of the Mac, for example, to walking around looking at fast food stands, this became a kind of, this produced a kind of kit of parts, or you could say fragments of grammar, which were then put together. You can see some examples here. This is I'm sure you can tell, right? The monoblock chair with Rietveld's red and blue chair. But it was this kind of operation. So a chair, 70s IKEA, with a kind of antler hunter type chair. The task was to try to find a way to fuse those to become a third thing, which perhaps goes beyond the references themselves. So in this case, bam. Or here, big bits of public furniture for public space with exquisite furniture for domestic spaces. How might those two things kind of breed? What might they do if they had an offspring? And so through this, these kinds of ideas about furniture began to, I think, also think about the role of furniture, both as a thing which organizes us, our body, how we sit, but also where we sit. So to think about furniture as something which is also contextual. I'll give you some more examples. Oh no, you won't get any more examples. Not today, but you will if you come to the talk that we're going to give as Studio Jacob at the Turn On Festival next Saturday. Other ways of thinking that we've been working on in the studio, this was part of a project called The Center and the Edge, which was a project which followed on from the furniture project. And this was thinking about two sites in Vienna, one right in the middle and one right at the edge, essentially the Hofburg and the very, very edge of the city. Thinking about what, I think for students, like what's the difference between the center and the edge? How is it different urbanistically? How is it different symbolically? How's it different in terms of status, in terms of preservation, etc., etc.? And we began this project by doing, well, I suppose, measured drawings in inverted commas. I don't know how accurate they are, but drawing on the tradition of, let's say, the Grand Tour, where architects would, draw the things that they came across that would then become a lexicon of the work that they would do later in their career. Here we were making drawings, first of all, of parts of the Hofburg, and then things that were found at the edge of the city. Part of the approach here is to try to look in a way which gives as much significance to things which usually are not given so much significance, whether that's because of who's made them, how they're made, where they are, those kinds of things. To begin to look in a less, let's say, prejudiced or less judgmental way, and to see what might happen when you start to do that. So to try to sort of explode the categories which often precede our relationship to the world in general, but certainly to the kind of the ways in which the canon has been organized. These things are important, those things are not important. So through kind of combinations of those, or using those as examples, the students developed two projects simultaneously, working in groups. And they made one project for the center, one project for the edge. And Herman was very kind to come and give us lots of advice at our midterm review. So this is actually some of the finished projects that you'll see here. On the one hand, here you have a project which is a renovation of a derelict brick factory, and then a small building inserted into the Hofburg. They have a relationship in terms of their program and materially. I suppose underlying this project was an idea of how do you deal with a city which is pretty, it's pretty much been built already. At the Hofburg, we're under UNESCO protection. What does it mean to think about conservation? What does it mean to think about additions or change? Which is a very, I suppose, like a sort of very European question. Other projects were interested in a kind of very urban setting. This one takes out the central section here to make a new vista through, and then was interested in the changes in axes that might be able to be developed, and then placing objects on the, within that urban setting. Or here in the Berggarten, they were interested in taking ideas about nature, so switching between, let's say, the picturesque layout of the bird garden with agricultural production on the edge of Vienna? What might happen if you took greenhouses into the center and took other ways of organizing, in this case it was a seed bank, into the big landscapes of greenhouses on the edge of Vienna? I suppose a lot of what we're trying to do in the studio is to think about relationships, and especially to think about, I guess, relationship between the contemporary and the historical. This was a piece that we made for last year's festival, which I can describe it to you, but I'm sure you can see what it is. Neolithic dolmen, which is made as a transparent inflatable. I guess to decode it even further, the inflatable representing an idea of the future, maybe now a nostalgic idea of the future, of course drawing on the traditions of the 60s and 70s, but also coupling that with structures that were built 3,000, 2,000 years before Christ. I'm going to move on now to talk about projects from my studio. So I'm going to start by talking about a project which is to do with, I guess, issues of who is represented. But it's also to do with who gets to make decisions, who chooses. It's a project that was kind of run as a co-design exercise with students from a school. They were about 14 years, 15 years old. So there were many people with many eyes, with many visions, and the project tried to draw on the possibilities of what happens when you have that kind of multitude making something. A project about references, about hybridity, about recombination, and I think also about objects which are formed through conversation. So objects become, I suppose, a way of communicating between a place and a site, between a community. And so they become something which can start to articulate particular sensations, particular narratives, particular ways of occupying space. This is the context, which is Battersea Park in the south side of the River Thames in London. It's a beautiful park full of many different things, a Chinese pagoda, a Barbara Hepworth, an Italian garden, etc., etc. We worked with the students who went around, first of all, photographing aspects of the park, whatever took their fancy. And from that, we developed a kit of parts. Some of these here, these different elements which had been they'd identified in their strolls through the park. And then they worked to put those together to make a kind of agglomerations of each of them, which you can see them working on here. Then making sketches of them, which became the kind of design documents for their fabrication. And then made as these small pieces of furniture which sit in front of a gallery in the middle of the park. Assemblages of different elements that you might find, a part of a column, a pyramid, a Barbara Hepworth turned on its side that becomes a table, pieces of Gothic architecture. I think this part was originally the sole of a Wellington boot, which a child had lost in the park. I guess other ways of working contextually, which also begin to kind of draw on those kinds of ways of thinking. And this is for a small building in the East End of London called the Hoxton Mule. It's a project which begins with a story about this guy, who's called Thomas Fairchild, who was a gardener, a kind of plantsman in the late 17th and early 18th century. He was the first person to scientifically produce an artificial hybrid plant. That's it in the middle, what he produced. And it was known as Fairchild's Mule. And it was a cross between a Sweet William and a carnation. And, of course, we probably know how that works, but he took a little bit of pollen from the Sweet William and brushed it onto the carnation. This was in 1716. And the next spring, a new plant appeared. Of course, at that time, Fairchild was somewhat disturbed by what had happened. It kind of messed with the idea of creation, the nature of beings, that kind of thing. So he feared the consequences of disturbing the natural order. But of course, I think his surprise or his fear of what had happened, I think, is really interesting. Like, what happens when we start to be able to make hybrids? What happens when we do disturb the natural order of things? Or what happens when we understand that the natural order of things is simply a construct and it's something that we can begin to, let's say, play with or recombine or find other ways of bringing things together? This was Fairchild's nursery where he grew his plants. And it's in the same site as where this project is. So this is where one of the connections come from. The project itself starts with this derelict pub. It's a pub which hadn't been used as a pub since the 1960s and instead had been used for all kinds of community uses. But as you can see, it was in an absolutely terrible state, propped up with giant pieces of timber, brickwork, bowing. And the last remnant of the historic fabric of this part of London, which had typically been these terraced houses, and in part through bombing and in part through so-called slum clearance in the 1950s, the entire terrace had been pulled down, leaving this one building remaining. And you can see, well, maybe you can see on the maps of the area, the significant change, not just in the buildings themselves, but in the fabric of the city. It goes from something which has a kind of clarity of, at least a kind of urban grain of that you'd expect in that part of London, to something which is much looser, much bigger buildings built from the 50s, 60s, 70s, which have a much stranger relationship to the ground, a much stranger relationship to each other, and the kind of sense of the city begins to fall apart, the space between them, which is kind of completely atypical. It had been used for all kinds of, here's some kids in the 70s hanging out there, the 3-in-1 club in Hackney. So it had been used for all kinds of different things, which I think was important for the owners of the site. They'd inherited the site, and they ran a family centre. So where families, usually single mothers from the surrounding estates, could come, play, learn, cook, meet each other, this kind of thing, outside of the typical networks of kindergartens and nurseries and schools. So kind of a little bit adjacent to the type of care that's provided through the state, but entirely on a charitable level. Anyway, these guys owned this plot of land and wanted to redevelop it. So we worked together with them as a kind of joint venture to see how that could happen. I want to show you kind of what that is. First of all, it becomes a pretty solid building which sits on this strange site in this strange context. And it has a kind of number of reasons of why it ends up like this. I'll show you this. It's a little bit pixelated, but you can see, like here, maybe this is where the city still kind of maintains its historic past. Up here, a gigantic Victorian school with its playground, so that becomes one object. Here, housing blocks for the 1950s. And then all of these kinds of strange bits of land which kind of flow around the buildings, or as if the buildings have been placed there like giant blocks. This is the facade of the old pub, and you can see some of the housing in the distance. And a very odd scale as well. There's nothing kind of consistent to it. Around, you find these very odd typologies. So here, this is the kind of high street. That's a market street. Here on the front, the lower level is a retail unit. And then on the top is housing. But it has a very strange arrangement where this becomes deck access. This is a very big, wide landing. So kind of, if the Smithsons were describing it, they'd call it a street in the sky. But a very odd typology. That's one which is really uncommon, certainly in London. You can see that a little bit more here. Strange relationships between the ground, where you start walking up some steps onto a kind of another piece of public space, and then into an apartment. Odd sculptural arrangements. Here's the waste chutes for the very early housing estate in that area. Views here of the 50s blocks with their plant rooms and on the top, little objects. The school adjacent. So it felt to me like a kind of place where there was these urban things floating around a little bit unmoored from where they should be. Lots of blankness as well. Sometimes because they're not quite sure which way's the front, or if there is a front. So the typical relationships you would have kind of disappeared a little bit. And maybe sometimes there's not quite an understanding of how these buildings should be addressing the city. The wall to the school, incredibly blank, but very beautiful at the same time. So the project developed a kind of interest in how things could be nothing or blank, or lots of stuff kind of agglomerated together. The site itself is a kind of accident of history and an accident of planning. So this rectangle here was the kind of footprint of the old pub. It would have been a terrace running all the way this way, and all the way this way. But once that terrace had gone, at some point, somebody drew on a map this U shape. Absolutely, there's no reference, nothing to do with anything around it. There's no reason why there should be a U there, but there is. It seems interesting, I think, then to think about that act of representation, and then in the response that we made, which was to essentially accept that drawing and extrude it. So it becomes a U-shaped building, wrapping around the remnants of the pub. And that U shape gets repeated. It becomes almost like the only motif in the plan. So you have an outer U, then a setback for another U here. And then you come in at the first floor level. There's another U inverted, the center of the plan, which takes you up. And up again in the U, then more repetitions of it sticking out of this facade. And then up onto the roof, where you get a kind of small repetition of the bigger U. So it's a kind of repetition of this one motif to try to use that to do as many things as possible. You see it also on the gate, the U shape for the gate, which is also its address, 54A. A little bit like Studio 54 logo. And here you are coming up between two of the U's, the outer edge and the inner edge. Up, up, up. The wall gets lower and lower as you get higher. And then this is the inverted, rotated, U-shaped staircase, which takes you up through the building, obviously. Then the reflected bay window. The U also returns in the handles of the kitchen cabinet, so you're kind of touching the site plan as you're opening a cupboard to get your, I don't know, coffee, biscuits or whatever. I think this was the first project I was working on after FAT, and I spent a lot of time trying to not do fat things. So no cutouts, no funny games, no expression in the brickwork, with all the things which we had been, I guess, known for at FAT. One of the things was trying to think about how to use that brick, perhaps drawing on the wall of the school, to think about like wrapping it around. So it's a wall not less like the wall of a building and more like the wall you'd find in a garden. But of course there are a few fun and games. So the shower curtain is a brick pattern that you can wrap around that's flexible. So there's a kind of reference to it there. Internally there's I guess games that play with the space. It's an odd space because you have one which is a U shape and one half of it which is much more traditional. This is a view through where you have mirrors which reflect and double the space. And then views into that U-shaped room. Which itself has kind of protrusions into the space as though it also was an external wall. A kind of remnant of the wall of the building which was inherited and swallowed by this project. And then just very simple things like here's the staircase coming up, the wall that forms the balustrade on one side of it is also a step, and that step then slots through into the cuts. So it's a very simple, I think, move that the bricklayers did an incredible job making sure that it lined up and worked out. So other aspects, if I go back to it a little bit, is also about references. If we can get to something with the outside. So it's a project which combines, let's say, references to its very local context. So the way in which you enter the apartment above the ground floor draws on some of these typologies of the retail units with their strange apartment buildings above. Its objectness draws on references, I think, to or echoes aspects of this Victorian school or this housing. But also the ways in which you have, let's say, a very strong form with lots of different things breaking out of it. You know, all of these kind of, air handling units, little additions. So this side of the building begins to sort of like think about a building which has accretions, things which have been added to it, even as it's kind of, in its original form. but at the same time having incredible solidity and blankness to some of these facades, which is accentuated by having a very, very tiny circular window. So it feels very kind of massive, but at the same time thinks about the lightness of objects which can inhabit it. So there's a set of references which come from the local vernacular, and of course there's a set of references which come from, let's say, the canon. And it's an assemblage of those kinds of things. It's a building then which talks, I suppose, to a sensibility about architecture, but also to its incredibly local context. And I think its character comes from the combination of those two things, the dialogue that those two kind of sets of references have between each other. In that sense, it kind of works a little bit like Fairchild's Mule as a hybrid object, a thing which can only exist because of its relationships, because of the things which it's trying to bring together, because it's it is the fruit of many pollen. That idea of hybridity, of cross-pollination, I think is something which is embedded in the way in which we have thought about architecture, often trying to sort it out. This is the introduction page of the book Bannister Fletcher's A History of Architecture, which I don't know how familiar you guys are with it, but it's the book which you start architecture with in the UK. It's the story of architecture, and this is the diagram which is at the beginning of the book, the tree of architecture, with its trunk here and its branches, Egyptian, Assyrian, Chinese and Japanese, and you follow up the trunk, Greek, Roman, Romanesque, and then its branches coming off, Byzantine, English, Spanish, Belgian and Dutch, and then the top of the tree, revivals, modern styles, and revivals. The top of the tree is American, by the way. This is a 19th century diagram. This is when this book was originally written. It's in its 12th, 15th edition now, and it keeps getting expanded and expanded. But it's a diagram as much about an idea of architecture as it is about, well, it's much more a diagram of an idea about architecture than it is about really being able to tell us about any of the origins of architecture. I mean, this is a diagram about a myth about architecture. It talks about beginnings and ends. It talks about things which are important, things which are less important, and things which are not on the tree at all, things which are not included in the story of architecture. These kinds of categorizations, I think, belong to a particular moment. Clearly, 19th century British story of architecture comes from a very particular place, a very particular time, a very particular view of the world. But also the way in which information is organized, the way in which it talks about periods of time, geographic locations, is also, it's very specific. And it's certainly only one way of thinking about how you organize information. What might that be now, in an age of digital information and digital storage? What might it be in an age of AI even? So these were some tests using Bannister Fletcher's tree as the kind of origin point to think about a more rhizomic idea of the organization of information. So this was essentially trying to ask AI to think about how it would write the story of architecture, and certainly to think about how relationships might be drawn in a different way, rather than you begin with the roots and you go to the top of the tree, you go to the twigs, you go to the leaves, something which has a much more dynamic form of connection. I don't know if it did a great job, I have to say. But then this is another way of thinking about the organization of architecture, the story of architecture, the organization of knowledge, the relationship between, let's say, aspects of the canon. Charles Jenks's famous diagram, which begins with 4 moments: functionalism, Beaux-Arts, utopian, and folk. And of course, it kind of dissipates. It's like a kind of river flowing out into the estuary, into smaller and smaller streams, chronologically organized. I think this one begins in 1920 and ends in the year 2000. And of course, he made many, many versions of this map, and they got more and more ridiculous. And in some ways, I always thought there was an irony to it. Of course, there was some irony to it. It was Charles Jenks drawing these diagrams. I thought these were a kind of almost like a kind of extreme version of the diagrams like those drawn by Alfred Barr when he was establishing MoMA, when he was drawing the diagram about the origins of Cubism, which is kind of a flow chart. I think this is Charles Jenks kind of overplaying that to a ridiculous extent. And I think he was very aware of it. And as an aside, I think he got to a point where he didn't really need the diagram anymore. I think the diagrams became the spaces that he created in his land art. He was interested in the flow in the end, not really the points. Anyway, here is Charles Jenks's evolutionary tree diagram, reimagined using large language models. That's an interesting phrase, large language model. You think of Jenks with his language of postmodern architecture. What might it mean to go one step beyond the idea of eclecticism? What might it be to move to a place where instead of having a number of things that we can hold in our head, we have 8 billion things that continue to, that form the archive? Is it the end of the canon? Is it after the canon? Does it obliterate it? Does it become a new kind of canon? Anyway, these are some of the things which were generated. New phrases in the Jenksian tradition: ditotal, contractual, idspili, forma, think, punctrek, contractual, combululi, kindaya, macro, minorda, batowidism, conticatisi, getatal, neodenstrium, double eclecticism, regio moderne, Oranism. Maybe. So many versions, many versions. If that's about like opening things up to maybe the entirety of all human knowledge that's ever been produced, hybridity working in very specific ways. Here at the entrance for the V&A Museum in London, drawing on the museum's tradition of using the public parts of the museum as exemplars in design. For example, when it opened, you had rooms by arts and crafts designers, William Morris, other people like that. So the functional aspects of the museum become part of the museum's, let's say, cultural program. The project we were working on was to do with the entrance at the Cromwell Road, so the very grand, Grade 1 listed, designed by Aston Webb entrance. Dark, noisy, a lot of dust coming in. So a set of objects, one around the entrance, one for the ticket desk, used aspects of the museum's collection, in this case the glassware gallery, as the kind of jumping off point for something which could be both super functional but begin to talk about the kind of cultural program of the museum itself. And the same in other aspects of the project, where you go into, say, the toilets, and there you find in the cubicle a giant-sized, life-size reprint of one of the people in the ceramics collection of the museum. Another way to encounter the culture that the museum contains. Here we have Josiah Wedgwood holding one of his vases in one of the alcoves on the a facade of the museum. So Wedgwood is a little bit before the V&A is established, but he's the kind of model. He's the kind of hero of an applied arts museum. He's the guy who did it. They also have an incredible collection of Wedgwood in the museum, but they make sure that they don't break it. That's one of their main jobs, is not to smash the vases. We smashed lots of Wedgwood vases. We worked with the factory that produces the Jasperware, which is up in Stoke in the Midlands in England. And all of their seconds, all of the things which were coming off the production line but had a tiny fault that they would not accept. I mean, for me, it looked absolutely perfect. I couldn't see anything wrong with it. But they put it aside, so we had, I think, 2 tons of waste Jasperware, which we crushed once and crushed twice till it was in tiny pieces. This is it, getting crushed. But unbelievably fun. so satisfying, so wrong. and all of that crushed Jasperware we turned it into sheets of terrazzo, which we then lined the basement toilet. So it was a little bit like going into a kind of archaeology of broken pottery. It's a little bit like going into the opposite of the museum, a place where everything has been smashed. But it also looks so delicious, you almost want to lick it, although I wouldn't advise it. We do a lot of work with museums in different ways. We do a lot of exhibitions. We do a lot of kind of remodeling. And we've been working on a project which has just opened for the Science Museum in the UK. And it's for their collections centre. So it's for all the stuff which isn't on display. And they're a very big museum group. They have a big museum in London. They have a railway museum in York. They have a TV, film and media museum. They have another museum of industry in Manchester. They have a very big collection. And the collection is also of very big things, or at least part of the collection is of very big things. Transport, industry, space, lots of things. They also have lots of very small things. They've been working on a way of, I think all of the museums in London had a big central storage place, but the government sold it, so they all had to move out. The Science Museum's approach was to build a massive shed, like a kind of Amazon logistics hub. No architectural merit whatsoever, but a fantastic space, absolutely huge. Our job was to help them organize stuff in space. So it's a kind of extreme form of architecture, like no walls, just placing things. And part of that is done on this big grid. This is for the large objects, obviously. Very big, 3,488 square meters, 109 meters that way, 32 meters that way. And objects which are placed there, but always need to be accessed. So they have to move them. They might need to go be in an exhibition. Some of the things need to be driven in order to keep them working. They've got an electric car from about 1902 that once a year they have to drive around to make sure it doesn't seize up. So part of the job was incredibly practical. It was about finding a grid size that would allow all of these objects to be able to move in, slot out, so they could get to anything. Giving it a kind of color coding, shape coding, which could help people locate them. But it was also about a sort of urban project. It was about how, where are the places that you might want to look at this? Where would you see objects? The point where you come into the building, a kind of another key point, a view across the whole space. So a kind of almost like thinking about like view corridors. So we spent an awful lot of time working on the layout of these objects so that you would come in here, lower objects all along this edge, which is where you walk, and then they range up to the highest one right in the middle at the back here. I'll show you a time lapse. It took them 2.5 years to move objects into the space. There's like 380,000 objects, I think, here. You can see one monk, it's just disappeared from the cabin of one of Montgolfier's balloons to the early attempts for British nuclear missiles, things that have been to space, things that have been to the bottom of the ocean, things that have been to Antarctica, alongside completely boring things like a completely average car, a normal bus, like a really amazing eclectic mix of objects. 2.5 years in 2.5 seconds. So you can see here, yeah, like nothing special at all, nothing special at all, pretty boring. But then, historic objects. Yeah, Trans-Arctic editions is the snowcat. So what we were working on really was, first of all, a structure, a way of organizing stuff, and then secondly, a way in which that stuff could, kind of just be viewed. This is not a typical museum. It doesn't tell you anything. There's no labels for anything. It's more of a kind of, let's say, encounter with large objects. I don't know if any of you are fans of Doctor Who, but they also have a Dalek here. So this is the shed. It's on an old airfield, an old American air base. And we've also been working with them on kind of just making it a little bit more human. It's a building really not for people, much more for objects, although there are people in there. But working on landscaping at the front of the building, places for school visits where the patterns from the grid start to come out onto the tarmac, so that, let's say, some of the spatial sensibility of objects on a surface start to become part of how humans can have a playful interaction. Yeah, if this is one of the origin stories of architecture, that architecture is a sort of, its alchemy is that it's a representation pretty much of itself, that the tree becomes the column, that the wooden building becomes the stone building. There's a sort of transubstantiation, and that architecture is the alchemy which makes that happen, that makes the kind of, let's say, narratives and myths into something which is solid and real. I think that's at foundation what an idea of architecture as representation might spring from. That it's always been an act of representation. But maybe that act or the idea of representation changes. And it changes according to an era, or it changes contextually, or it changes from project to project. This last project that I'm going to show you, the most photographed barn in America, is a project which is inspired by the novel White Noise by Don DeLillo. Fantastic novel, if I'm sure many of you read it. But it has a passage in it about the most photographed barn in America. And I'll read you a bit of that passage. And it goes a little bit like this. We drove 22 miles into the country around Farmington. There were meadows and apple orchards. White fences trailed through the rolling fields. Soon the sign started appearing, the most photographed barn in America. We counted 5 signs before we reached the site. There were 40 cars and a tour bus in the makeshift lot. We walked along a cow path to the slightly elevated spot set aside for viewing and photographing. All the people had cameras. Some had tripods, telephoto lenses, filter kits. A man in a booth sold postcards and slides. It's quite old, this book now. Pictures of the barn taken from the elevated spot. We stood near a grove of trees and watched the photographers. Murray maintained a prolonged silence, occasionally scrawling some notes in a little book. No one sees the barn, he said finally. A long silence followed. Once you've seen the signs about the barn, it becomes impossible to see the barn. He fell silent once more. People with cameras left the elevated site, replaced by others. We're not here to capture an image, we're here to maintain one. Every photograph reinforces the aura. Can you feel it, Jack? An accumulation of nameless energies. There was an extended silence. The man in the booth sold postcards and slides. Being here is a kind of spiritual surrender. We see only what the others see, the thousands who were here in the past, those who will come in the future. We've agreed to be part of a collective perception. It literally colors our vision, a religious experience in a way, like all tourism. Another silence ensued. They are taking pictures of taking pictures, he said. End of that passage. But I feel there's some truths about architecture here, or lessons that we could learn. When he says, we're not here to capture an image, we're here to maintain one. In a sense, one of architecture's jobs is to maintain, not just maintenance of buildings, but to maintain an idea of the way in which we want to live, how we want to be organized. What else is architecture apart from an accumulation of nameless energies? What else is it apart from the thousands who were here in the past and those who will come in the future, as well as the very present moment? So I feel it's a very, this is obviously a book which comes from a kind of traditional postmodern literature in the US. And it's talking about a particular moment of media saturation in the 1980s, 1990s. And for us, that condition has only accelerated, certainly in the last 15 years. You know, the internet, Google Images, AI, all of these kinds of things are changing our relationship to information, changing our relationship to how we understand the world. We're no longer buying slides at a tourist destination. We might be scanning a QR code or encountering and filtering media in many other ways. And perhaps even more than was happening at the time Don DeLillo was writing. And maybe it means that our understanding of things like the canon, histories of architecture, as well as context and sites and clients and users, has also changed. This is the most photographed barn in America. It's not a fictional place, it's a real place just outside Jackson Hole in Wyoming. And these are a whole load of pictures stolen from the internet. Some of them very professional, some of them completely shit. It looks like a wonderful place, but the barn is completely ordinary, and maybe that's what makes it the most famous barn in America. It's the kind of barn. It's its barniness is completely barn-like. We used that set of images. I think we had about 320, something like that, and put it into some photogrammetry software. Which is the kind of software you can put loads of two-dimensional images into, and somehow in the black box of the software it can calculate positions of where each photo was taken relative to another photo, and from that can construct a 3D model. Here it is recognizing some points. Like, okay, these are the points, which it starts to match together. Here it is mapping the positions of all of those photos, where they were taken from, or at least what the software, where it thinks that those photographs were taken from. And you can see it here piecing together information from each of those photographs up in the top of the screen there. So it's kind of machine looking, and it can see a lot, but it maybe doesn't understand the difference between a barn and a mountain. Gets a bit confused, doesn't know where one thing stops and the next thing starts. And in this case, it doesn't have all the information, because just like those tourists in White Noise, the photographs are all taken from one side. No one goes around the back to take a picture. They're all taken from pretty much the same place. So it only has a lot of information, but only about part of a building. So the model that was produced is also kind of partial. Like, it's a model not of a barn, it's a model of photographs of a barn. So it's kind of a model of it's a representation of representations of a piece of architecture. Buildings filtered through media. And in some senses, I feel like this is how we always relate to our environments. Like, we don't come to them, free of our own histories, cultural histories. We always come to them freighted with things. And maybe these are models a little bit about the ways in which we look at buildings, not as autonomous objects, but as things which are intrinsically part of the world. Maybe all architecture is a form of representation, and that we might not be able to tell quite the difference between the building, the model, and the drawing. Maybe the advantage of thinking about architecture in this way is to not think of it as a fait accompli, that it's always something which can be undone in order to be redone in new, different ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wide range of ideas and projects in this faraway place that you took us to in the end, looking back at ourselves from a distance. I think probably has a lot to do also with the projects that you showed, because they kind of redo and undo the context, by inserting themselves in a very specific way. So perhaps there's also a connection very directly to the project,
Yeah.
without making it too banal. But there's one question that came to my mind, and it had a little bit, has it, of course, the influence of going through your work today and preparation of this. There seems to be something sober and very solid about the projects that you showed. And I would be interested in, also because you mentioned that you had this need to do something else than you had done before. And I'm sure it's not just like rebellion, no? But it's probably something that has to do with changing of times or changing of context in which you work.
Yeah.
Because there's even not so much color.
No.
And,
no. Not in these projects. I mean, there's still a little bit of color.
Yeah.
But no, it's interesting. Times have definitely changed. Like, for those of you who don't know, FAT was sort of 95 to 2014. Certainly in the 90s, I don't know, like, we were off. Everyone always said to us, "Oh my God, your work is so ironic. You're so English and so ironic." And I don't know, like, wait, maybe it was true. Maybe it was. It definitely does not feel like a time of irony now, or maybe not in the same way, or it becomes more difficult, I think. We never quite knew what people were saying in the first place. We always thought that maybe irony was a useful tool, that irony is a way that allows you to say what you really want to say, but without being embarrassed about it. You can be sincere without appearing sincere. You can say, yeah, I mean, that's what Charles Jenks would always say. You know, he said it's, yeah.
It's also a way of taking something seriously.
Yeah,
no?
yeah. And so I think the other aspect of FAT was that we wanted to be aggressive, I think. We wanted to make projects which were a little bit difficult to take. And I think it's one of the reasons that we stopped. We felt that the project had gone as far as it could have gone, and that between us we couldn't find another mode to work in, that we'd gone off in different directions and wanted to do our folk album or a jazz album or whatever. But for me, it was trying to think about how could you think about the same set of ideas but find a different aesthetic kind of or material way of manifesting it. So I think, yeah, explicitly it was trying to say, okay, I'm still interested in, let's say, the idea of language, idea of being able to use a variety of references, a certain kind of eclecticism, but perhaps that doesn't need to be expressed, you know, kind of in such a aggressively flippant way, you know, that it's not, everything's not quite, you know, everything's not a stage set. Like, even though it might well be a stage set, it can be real at the same time. So I think that was the thing which I wanted to start to resolve in the projects. But I think, yeah. So that was what I was trying to get rid of.
It's interesting. I think there's a lot to think about there, no? Why it would seem more adequate in a different time to become more solid and perhaps even tasteful.
Yeah.
In a relatable way, no?
Yeah.
But could you tell us a little bit more just about the program of the Hoxton Mule? Because I think that's quite. There were now empty spaces, and they're not. I think no.
It's quite no. It's quite simple. Like, it's on the ground floor and the basement. It's this very kind of local community family centre, and above it's an apartment, and the two are kind of supporting each other financially, and so it was as much about trying to find a kind of hybrid of financing and a hybrid of a kind of viable program as it was about like an architectural expression, which I think is also, you know, maybe interesting to think about, that it's not just a way of, it's not just an appearance, it's like embedded in the genesis of the project. It's embedded in the legal documents that enabled the project to happen. And in that sense, I suppose it's it's like a taking seriously of, like, what does it mean to co-produce something. So with that project with the school children making furniture is one way of thinking about it, then the Hoxton project is more fundamental in like how does architecture come, how can architecture or how can buildings come into the world now, you know, within the frameworks of finance and mortgages and all of these kinds of things, land ownership and that, yeah.
So there is a political undertone, no? In the way you take the context and try to make it relatable also.
Yeah. I would say
which is a
definitely.
context that is quite given up for gentrification, no?
It's an interesting area. Like it's if you go to the sort of south of Hoxton, it's like nightclubs and it's a bit tawdry now, but it used to be where White Cube had a gallery. But the top ends, like one street, bottom to top, is incredibly different. Like big estates with, I'd say it remains like quite ungentrified in a strange way. London's the mix that you get in London is very unusual, I think, that you have, even in areas like Notting Hill, you can have, you know, Grenfell Tower, you know, minutes away. Like it's very, I think part of the history post-war was explicitly to try to get a much greater social mix. So a lot of social housing was built on bomb sites in areas which were kind of much wealthier areas. So it's very different from, let's say, the sort of cliche of a you know, Paris, for example, where I've just been. The suburbs being one thing and the centre being another thing. London's it's a stranger, more complicated place. I mean, it's stranger also in its urban form. Like it's never really had anyone think about it. You know, there's a few moments. You know, Regent's Park, Regent Street to the Mall is one moment someone thought about it. Building the embankment, another moment. A lot of London has just happened. You know, there was never a plan. There was never even anyone in charge. You know, for many years we didn't have an authority for London. We just had boroughs. You know, Margaret Thatcher closed the Greater London Council, which didn't like their politics. But it's, so London is a city that hasn't been created by so much top-down vision, like kings or emperors.
This house couldn't be anywhere else. I think
Yeah,
this is
I
something
think so.
very special and beautiful about this quite small house, that you could not translate it or transpose it to any other place.
I think so. I think also you couldn't really move it anywhere else in London because it's very specific to that particular place.
Yeah.
It's for sure.
So before I take up all the question time, we would be very happy to take questions, comments from the audience. Yeah, there's one.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your presentation and showing this project. I have only two simple ones. Question. The first one is about your studio. How many people? And another one is should architecture provoke or solve the problems?
That's the studio's pretty small. We're like 4 people. Between 4 and 10 people, depending on the what's happening, what day of the week it is, etc. So we're pretty small. Should architecture provoke or should it solve problems? Architecture should really, I think, pose questions. Probably, like, of course, it needs to solve problems. Like, of course, it does. Like, it needs to provide and needs to be, you know, it's used and stuff like that. But I don't think it's very helpful to think about architecture, being an architect, as a problem solving, as you are a problem solver. I think it's really about trying to think about, like, you know, how the space, and material, and structure and form, how does that serve us? You know, what does it do for us? what can it learn from the stuff that's around it? I think solving a problem kind of, first of all, it assumes there's a correct answer, which often there isn't. You know, even working as an architect, you realize immediately that there cannot be one answer because there's so many competing demands. It's always about finding compromise.
I think the more it confuses you, the better it is. The more fruitful it is.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what I think. Yeah.
Although very often it is about finding out what the problems might be, you know, or
For sure.
put the question of a site. And I think in the Hoxton Mule, it's quite obvious that you try to find out what is actually the question of this place.
Well,
And
I guess it's interesting. Just falling off my small ears. I guess it's like, what's the process of making a brief even? You know, like if you assume that a client provides you with a brief, you assume that they know what they want, or they know what would be good, or they know what would be...
What is the problem?
Yeah, and I think part of say, the benefit of working in more collaborative ways with stakeholders, partners, people, is that the idea of the brief gets stretched, it gets bigger, or it changes shape, and a lot of the job I think now is working on that part of things. Like it's really important. And I think it's also changing. I think there's more opportunity to do that, or there's more demand to do that. There's maybe less knowledge of how to do it, but.
Or perhaps it's also the field of work that you've sort of carved yourself out, no? That you get these assignments. Like in the Victoria and Albert Museum, I'm sure there were a lot of people also participating in the planning process.
Sure,
And
I mean,
a lot of
but in a project like that, it's working through from the concerns about security. So, like, you know, what happens if someone's running towards the museum with a machine gun? Will they, you know, to be able to that side of things, but at the same time to work with the curators from the glass department or the ceramics department. So it's, I think that's that aspect of taking what's a very functional brief in that case and expanding it by considering, of course, all the functional things it needs to do, but also the cultural or material qualities of it. Absolutely, yeah.
And the central counter also works as a bar, I've read.
Oh yes,
so
it does.
If there are no more questions, perhaps that's also the place that we should move to go
Amazing.
on talking.
Yes.
So if no one is raising their hand, I would invite you to just go on talking in a more informal way.
Wonderful. Thank you.